I want to tell you a story that I have carried inside me for most of my life. It is not the kind of story that wins awards or makes people cheer. It is the kind of story that sits in your chest for years, heavy and quiet, shaping every decision you make without anyone knowing why. I am sharing it now not because it is easy, but because I believe that the things we are most afraid to say aloud are often the things that most need to be heard. And if you have ever felt confused about who you are, if you have ever done something you could not explain and then spent years trying to understand it, then maybe something in these words will help you feel less alone. Dear friends, your one click can make a big difference. Subscribe now and help us bring you more amazing content every week. I grew up in a small town in the middle of England, the kind of place where everyone knows your family name and your business is never entirely your own. My father worked at a distribution warehouse about 40 minutes away by car, and my mother was a teaching assistant at the primary school just down the road from our house. I have an older sister, Megan, who is 3 years ahead of me. She was always the confident one, the one who walked into rooms like she belonged there, while I tended to hover near doorways, unsure whether I was supposed to be inside or outside. I do not say that to make myself sound tragic. I was a happy enough child in many ways. I had friends. I liked building things with Lego and watching nature documentaries and riding my bike along the lane behind our house. But there was always something underneath, a kind of restless questioning that I could not name, a sense that the picture everyone saw when they looked at me was slightly out of focus compared to the one I saw when I looked at myself. The first time I remember feeling it clearly, I was about 11 years old. Megan had just started secondary school and had been given her uniform, the navy blazer with a school crest on the pocket, the pleated skirt, the white blouse, the tie with its diagonal stripes. She laid it all out on her bed one evening before her first day, and I remember standing in the doorway of her room, looking at it spread there, and feeling something I had no language for. It was not desire in the way people might assume. It was more like recognition, as though the uniform belonged to a version of me that I had not been allowed to meet yet. I stared at the pleated skirt and the knee socks and the neat little blouse, and something inside me leaned forward, straining toward a shape I could not articulate. My sister noticed me staring and told me to stop being weird, and I laughed it off and walked away, but the feeling did not leave. It followed me to bed that night and lay beside me in the dark, formless and insistent.
I did not do anything about it then.
I was 11, and 11-year-olds do not generally have the vocabulary to understand what they are feeling when something inside them does not match what the outside world expects. I just knew that I could not stop thinking about that uniform, and I knew, with the instinctive certainty that children have about things they are not supposed to do, that I must never tell anyone. The thing about secrets is that they do not stay still. They grow. They fill up the spaces inside you that should be used for other things, for confidence and curiosity and ease, and instead they leave you with a low hum of anxiety that becomes so familiar you forget it is even there. For the next 2 years, I carried that hum. I went to school, I did my homework, I played football with my mates on the field behind the community center, I had tea with my family every evening, and underneath all of it, in a place I kept locked and dark, I thought about that uniform. I thought about what it would feel like to wear it. I thought about whether the blouse would be too tight across my shoulders or whether the skirt would hang wrong because my hips were not shaped the way my sister's were. I thought about these things with a precision that frightened me because the precision itself told me that this was not a passing thought. This was something that had taken root. When I was 13, the thing I had been dreading and waiting for happened at the same time. My parents went to a wedding in another city and stayed overnight, and Megan went to stay at her friend's house, and I was alone in the house for the first time for a full evening and night. My mother had left instructions about dinner and locking doors and not staying up too late, and I had nodded along to all of it, and the moment the car pulled out of the drive, I felt the lock inside me strain against its hinges. I did not rush upstairs. I sat in the kitchen and ate the lasagna my mother had left and watched television for an hour, and I told myself that I was not going to do it, that it was a stupid idea, that it meant nothing, that I was just curious in the way all kids are curious about things. And then I went upstairs and stood in front of Megan's wardrobe and opened it. I remember the smell of it. Her clothes smelled like the fabric softener my mother used and something else, something that was just Megan, just the specific way a teenage girl's closet smells when it has been closed all day. I took the uniform out piece by piece. The blazer first, then the blouse, then the skirt, then the tie, then the knee socks. I laid them on her bed the way she had laid them out that first evening, and I looked at them, and my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself I was just going to try the blazer. Just the blazer.
Just to see what it felt like.
And I put it on, and it was too big in the shoulders and too tight in the arms because Megan was taller than me but narrower, and it felt wrong and right at the same time. Wrong in the fit and right in some deeper way that I could not explain, a way that had nothing to do with the fabric and everything to do with what the fabric represented. I took the blazer off and put the blouse on. Then the skirt. Then the tie, which I had to look up how to knot on my sister's laptop because I had never worn a tie before. Then the knee socks. And then I stood in front of her full-length mirror and looked at myself, and I did not recognize the person looking back, and yet I recognized them completely. The boy in the mirror was wearing a girl's school uniform, and he looked awkward and strange, and the skirt was too long, and the blouse gaped at the collar, and the tie was crooked, and I stood there looking at this person, and I felt a wave of something so powerful that it frightened me. It was relief. It was the feeling of something clicking into place that I had not even known was out of place. It was the sensation of a question being answered that I had not known I was asking. I stood there for a long time. I do not know how long. I walked around the room in the skirt and felt it move against my legs, and I sat on the bed and crossed my legs the way I had seen Megan cross hers, and I looked at the mirror again, and each time the feeling was the same, this deep, aching rightness that was mixed with an equally deep and growing terror because I knew, even at 13, that the world did not have a place for this feeling. I knew that what I was doing was something people whispered about and laughed about and used as an insult. I knew that if anyone found out, it would change everything. And so I did what I had done with every other difficult feeling in my life up to that point. I took the uniform off, folded it carefully, put it back in the wardrobe exactly as it had been, and I went to my room and I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, steady weeping that seemed to come from somewhere below my stomach, and I did not fully understand what the tears were for. They were for the relief and the fear and the loneliness and the knowledge that I had just discovered something important about myself, and there was no one in the world I could tell. That was the beginning of what I now think of as the second phase of my life, the phase of fear. Because after that evening, the feeling did not go away. It intensified. I found myself looking at the uniform every time I passed Megan's room. I started paying attention to what the girls at school wore, not with any kind of romantic interest, but with a strange, yearning curiosity about what it would feel like to move through the world in those clothes in that way. I started to notice the differences in how boys and girls were expected to behave, the way boys were told to be tough and girls were told to be nice, the way boys sat with their legs apart and girls sat with their knees together, and I found myself drawn to the girls' side of every one of those expectations, not because I thought it was better, but because it felt more honest, more like the way I already was inside when no one was watching. But the fear was enormous. I was terrified of being discovered. I was terrified that someone could see it in me, that the thing I had done that evening had left a mark on me that was visible to anyone who looked closely enough. I became hyper-vigilant about my behavior. I made sure I never stood too close to Megan's wardrobe when anyone was around. I made sure I talked about girls the way my friends talked about girls, even though the way I talked about them was not the way my friends meant it. I threw myself into football with a ferocity that was really just panic disguised as enthusiasm. I became good at being the version of myself that the world expected, and I became worse at being the version of myself that I actually was, and the gap between those two versions grew wider every month. I tried the uniform on again. I want to be honest about that because dishonesty is what makes stories like this dangerous. I tried it on 3 more times over the next year, always when I was alone, always in Megan's room, always with the blinds drawn and the door locked, and each time the feeling was the same, and each time the aftermath was worse. Because each time I put it on, I felt that same click, that same rightness, and each time I took it off, I felt like I was stripping away something essential and putting on a costume that was heavier and less comfortable than the one I had just removed. The irony of that did not escape me. The world saw the boy clothes as the real me and the girl clothes as the costume, but inside my experience it was the other way around. The boy clothes were the performance. The girl clothes were the closest thing I had to honesty. The thing that the title of this story refers to, happened when I was 14. It was a Saturday morning and my parents had gone to a garden center and Megan was at her Saturday job at a bakery in town and I was alone and I did what I had done before. I went to her room and I put on the uniform and this time I did something I had never done before. I looked at myself in the mirror and I decided to walk around the house in it. Not just in Megan's room. Downstairs. In the kitchen. In the living room. I told myself it was safe because no one was home and the curtains were drawn and the front door was locked, and I wanted just for a few minutes to feel what it was like to exist in a space, in those clothes, not hiding in a bedroom, but actually living in a room, sitting on a sofa, standing at a window, being a person. I was in the living room, sitting on the sofa with my legs tucked under me, watching a wildlife program with the volume low, when I heard the front door open. My heart stopped. Literally stopped. I felt it seize in my chest, and then hammer back to life at twice its normal speed. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and I heard Megan's voice calling out that she had forgotten her apron and come back to get it, and I was on the sofa in her school uniform, and there was nowhere to go. The stairs were past the hallway. The kitchen was past the hallway. Every exit required passing the hallway. I froze. I sat there, and I froze, and I watched the living room door swing open and Megan walked in and she looked at me and I looked at her and the world went very, very quiet. She did not scream. She did not laugh. She stood in the doorway with her apron in her hand and she looked at me sitting there in her uniform and her face went through about 7 emotions in 2 seconds, confusion and recognition and shock and something that I now recognize as compassion but which at the time I read as horror. She said my name. Just my name. Once, like a question. And I could not speak. My throat had closed entirely. I sat there in her pleated skirt and her blouse and her crooked tie, and I could not say a single word. She stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 seconds, and then she walked over and picked up the remote and turned off the television, and she sat down on the armchair across from me and she said, very quietly, "How long has this been going on?" And I said, "I do not know." And she said, "Why are you wearing my uniform?" And I said, "I do not know." And she said, "You do know." And I said, "I really do not." And she said, "Okay." And there was a silence that I will remember for the rest of my life. A silence in which my entire future seemed to hang suspended, because I was certain that she was going to tell our parents, or that she was going to tell her friends, or that she was going to stand up and walk away and never speak to me again. And every one of those outcomes felt like the end of my life as I knew it. What she actually said was, "You need to take that off before Mom and Dad get back." And I nodded. And she stood up and she went to the hallway, and she picked up her apron and she left. And I sat there for another minute in the silence of the empty house, and then I went upstairs and I took the uniform off and I folded it and I put it back and I sat on my own bed and I shook. I shook for a long time. Not because she had caught me, but because of the look on her face when she had said, "You do know." Because she was right. I did know. I had known for a long time. And I had been lying to myself about it, and now someone else knew, and the lie was no longer sustainable. For 2 weeks, Megan did not mention it. 2 weeks of family dinners and television evenings and school runs and normal life, and she did not say a word about it, and I lived in a state of constant dread that turned every meal into an endurance test, and every moment alone with her into a tightrope walk. I kept waiting for the conversation, for the confrontation, for the moment when she would finally say what she thought about what she had seen, and the not knowing was worse than any conversation could have been. I lost weight. I stopped sleeping properly. My grades, which had never been spectacular, began to slip, and my mother noticed and asked if I was all right, and I said I was fine, and the word fine began to taste like ash in my mouth every time I said it. The conversation finally happened on a Sunday afternoon. My parents had gone to visit my aunt, and Megan and I were alone in the house, and she came into my room without knocking, which she never did, and she sat on the end of my bed, and she said, "We need to talk about what happened." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I am not going to tell Mom and Dad." And the relief that flooded through me was so overwhelming that I thought I was going to be sick. She said, "I am not going to tell anyone, but I need you to be honest with me because I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks and I have been scared and confused and I need to understand what is going on with you." So I told her. Not everything, because I did not have the words for everything, but I told her about the feeling, about the thing that had started when I saw her uniform on her bed, about how putting it on made me feel like a version of myself that I could not access any other way, about how I did not understand it, and I was frightened of it, and I did not know what it meant. I cried while I talked. I cried in a way I had not cried since I was a small child, with my whole body, and Megan did not try to stop me or comfort me in any of the ways people usually do. She just sat there and listened, and when I was done, she was quiet for a while, and then she said something that I think saved my life. She said, "I do not understand this, but I believe you, and I think you need to talk to someone who does." She helped me find a counselor. Not a gender specialist, not anything dramatic, just a general youth counselor at a community center in the next town over, and she drove me there for my first appointment, and she sat in the car park reading a book while I went in, and sat in a small room with a woman named Deborah, and tried to explain something that I had only just begun to articulate to my sister. Deborah did not label me. She did not tell me what I was, or what I was not. She asked me questions. She asked me what the clothes made me feel, and I said they made me feel like myself. She asked me what my regular clothes made me feel, and I said they made me feel like I was playing a part. She asked me whether I wanted to be a girl, and I said I did not know, and she said that not knowing was okay, and that was the first time anyone had told me that not knowing was okay, and it broke something open in me that I did not even know was sealed. I saw Deborah for about 6 months. During that time, I learned things about myself that I had been unable to learn alone. I learned that identity is not a switch that you flip. It is a landscape that you explore, and some people explore more of it than others, and that does not make them broken or wrong. I learned that the clothes were a symbol, a way of accessing feelings and aspects of myself that I had been told were not available to me as a boy, and that the clothes themselves were not the point was the feelings underneath them. I learned that I had been carrying an enormous amount of shame that did not belong to me, shame that had been handed to me by a world that has very rigid ideas about what boys are allowed to feel and express and be, and that the first step toward peace was to put that shame down and look at what was actually underneath it. Deborah also asked me about my relationship with my sister, and this was something I had not expected to examine. She asked me whether I resented Megan, whether I was jealous of her, whether the uniform was a way of taking something from her, and the questions made me uncomfortable because there was truth in them that I had not wanted to face. I had to think carefully about the ethics of what I had done. I had been wearing my sister's clothes without her permission, and regardless of what those clothes meant to me personally, that was a violation of her boundaries, and it was something I needed to take responsibility for. Deborah helped me see that understanding yourself and respecting others are not competing priorities. They are parallel obligations, and you cannot truly grow if you are doing one at the expense of the other. I told Megan this. I told her I was sorry for wearing her clothes without asking, and I told her I understood if she was angry, and I told her that I was grateful that she had responded with more compassion than I deserved. She listened, and she said she appreciated the apology, and then she said something that surprised me. She said she had been reading about it, about cross-dressing and gender identity and the difference between them, and she said she had learned that a lot of people go through this, and that she had been angry at first, not because of the clothes but because I had not trusted her enough to tell her, and that the anger had turned into worry, and the worry had turned into a decision to try to understand. She said, "You are my brother, and I love you, and I do not need to understand everything about you to stand beside you, and I want you to hear that because I think you have been standing alone with this for a long time, and you do not have to anymore." That conversation was the end of the fear phase, and the beginning of something else, something harder in a different way. Because when the fear lifts, what you are left with is the reality, and the reality is that you have learned something about yourself that does not fit neatly into the life you have built, and now you have to figure out what to do with that knowledge. This is the phase I think of as reflection, and it lasted for years, well into my late teens and early 20s, and it was the most intellectually and emotionally demanding period of my life. I stopped wearing Megan's uniform. That was important to me, both as an ethical decision and as a personal one. I had used it as a crutch, a way of accessing feelings without actually building a life that could contain those feelings, and I needed to stop relying on it and start finding other ways to understand myself. Deborah had introduced me to the idea that the clothes were a doorway, not a destination, and I needed to walk through the doorway and see what was on the other side rather than standing in the threshold forever. What was on the other side was complicated. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I actually wanted. Did I want to live as a woman? Did I want to transition? Did I want to dress in women's clothes in my daily life? Or did I want something more subtle? A loosening of the rules I had imposed on myself. A permission to express aspects of my personality that I had associated with femininity and therefore forbidden to myself? The answer, after a long time, was that it was the last one, at least for that period of my life. I was not experiencing gender dysphoria in the way that I later learned some transgender people describe it. I did not feel that my body was wrong. What I felt was that the social role I had been assigned was too narrow, that it cut off parts of me that were real and important, and that the uniform had been a way of experiencing those parts in a concentrated, symbolic form. This is a distinction that matters, and I want to be careful about it because I think the world often confuses these things. Crossdressing is not the same as being transgender, though they can overlap, and though some people who crossdress do later come to understand themselves as transgender. For me, at that stage of my life, crossdressing was a form of self-exploration, a way of testing the boundaries of the identity I had been given and discovering that those boundaries were more permeable than I had been told. It was not a permanent statement about who I was. It was a question asked through fabric and mirrors, and the answer it gave me was not "you are a woman," but "you are more than you have allowed yourself to be." I want to be clear that this was my experience and my understanding, and that everyone's journey is different. I have known people who began with experiences similar to mine, and who eventually realized that they were transgender and transitioned, and their paths are just as valid as mine. I have known people who crossdress throughout their lives as an ongoing part of how they express themselves, and that is valid too. The point is not to fit your experience into a category. The point is to follow your own truth wherever it leads, with honesty and self-respect, and a willingness to keep learning about yourself even when the learning is uncomfortable. The reflection phase was also when I had to confront the social dimension of what I had discovered. Because it was one thing to understand myself in the privacy of a counselor's office or in conversations with my sister, and it was quite another to live in the world with that understanding. The world has opinions about men who wear women's clothes, and those opinions are rarely kind. I had to think about what I was willing to share and with whom, and I had to accept that there would be people who, if they knew, would reduce everything I was to this one thing, would flatten the complexity of my experience into a punchline or a prejudice, and that I could not control that, but I could control how I carried it. I told 2 of my closest friends. I chose them carefully, and I told them separately, and both conversations were terrifying and both went better than I had feared and not as well as I had hoped. One friend, Tom, listened and said he did not fully understand but that it did not change anything between us, and he was true to that, though there was a period of awkwardness that took several months to fully resolve. The other friend, who I will not name, listened and said he was fine with it, but then began making jokes about it in front of other people, subtle enough to plausibly deny, but pointed enough that I felt them, and I had to make the difficult decision to distance myself from him, which meant losing a friendship that had been important to me and learning that not everyone who says they accept you actually does, and that discernment about who to trust is not cynicism, it is wisdom. College was a turning point. I went to a college in a larger city, far enough from home that I was not constantly surrounded by people who had known me since childhood, and the anonymity was both liberating and lonely. I joined a drama group, not because I wanted to perform, but because drama was the one space I had found where playing with identity was explicitly encouraged, where trying on different ways of being was not just tolerated but celebrated as a skill. I did not cross-dress in the drama group, not at first, but I played female roles in workshops and exercises, and the experience of being seen and responded to as a different gender in a controlled, respectful environment taught me an enormous amount about how much of what we consider to be natural gender behavior is actually learned performance, and how freeing it can be to recognize that. It was through the drama group that I met people who expanded my understanding of what was possible. I met a young man who wore skirts to class every day and did not explain it to anyone and did not owe anyone an explanation. I met a young woman who had been raised as a boy and was navigating the early stages of transition with a courage that I found humbling. I met people who rejected gender categories entirely and people who embraced them enthusiastically and people who were, like me, still figuring it out. And being around that diversity taught me that there is no one right way to be a person, and that the pressure to conform to a single model of masculinity or femininity is not a natural law but a social convention, and conventions can be questioned and gently,
Respectfully expanded.
I did, eventually by my own clothes. Not Megan's. My own, chosen carefully in my own size, in styles that I had thought about and selected for myself. This was a significant step, because it moved the experience out of the territory of borrowed secrecy and into the territory of personal agency. I was no longer sneaking into someone else's life to access a feeling. I was building a small, private space in my own life where that feeling could exist legitimately. I wore the clothes at home, in my own room, with the door locked, and I did not share this with anyone except Megan, who I told because I had promised her I would be honest, and who said she was glad I was finding my own way with it rather than using her things. And the conversation was brief and ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was itself a kind of healing. I want to talk about the relationship with my parents, because it is the part of the story that remains the most complicated. I did not tell them for a long time.
Years.
Through the rest of my teenage years and into my early 20s, I kept this part of my life separate from them. Not because I assumed they would reject me, but because I was not ready to navigate their reaction, whatever it might be, on top of everything else I was navigating. My mother, I think, sensed that there was something I was not telling her. She is perceptive in the way that mothers often are, and there were moments when she looked at me with a question in her eyes that she did not voice, and I was not brave enough to answer it. My father, I believed, would struggle with it more, not because he is unkind, but because his worldview is structured around clear categories, and this does not fit into any category he has, and I was afraid that his confusion would manifest as distance, and I did not think I could bear distance from him. When I finally told them, I was 23. I was living on my own, I had a job, I had been in therapy on and off for years, and I had reached a point where the energy required to maintain the separation between this part of my life and my family was greater than the energy required to risk being honest. I told my mother first, over the phone, on a Tuesday evening, and the conversation was long and halting, and she asked questions that were clumsy and well-meaning, and I answered them as patiently as I could, and at the end of it she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I love you, and I want you to be happy, and I do not understand all of this, but I will try." And I hung up the phone, and I sat in my flat, and I felt a lightness that I had not felt in years, the lightness of a secret that has finally been set down. Telling my father was harder. I did it in person at the kitchen table on a visit home, and Megan was there because I had asked her to be there, and I told him in the most straightforward way I could, and he listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him, and when I was done he looked at the table for a long time, and then he said, "I do not know what to say," and I said, "You do not have to say anything," and he said, "I want to say something, I just do not know what," and we sat there in the silence, and it was uncomfortable and tense, and also, in a strange way, honest, because he was not pretending to understand something he did not understand, and he was not rejecting something he could not yet accept. He was just sitting with it, and sitting with something is often the first step toward being able to hold it. My father and I did not talk about it again for almost a year. That year was difficult. There were family gatherings where I could feel the unspoken thing in the room, and there were moments when I caught him looking at me with an expression I could not read, and I had to remind myself that his process was his own, and that I could not rush it without violating the same principle I had asked him to respect, which is that identity unfolds on its own timeline and not on anyone else's. When he finally did bring it up, it was unexpected. We were in the car, driving to get something from the hardware shop, and he said out of nowhere, "I have been reading about it," and I said, "About what?" And he said, "About what you told me," and I said, "Okay," and he said, "I still do not fully understand it, but I have been reading, and I think I understand it better than I did, and I want you to know that." And that was it. That was the whole conversation.
And it was enough.
Because what he was really saying was, I am trying, and trying, from a man who has never had to question any of the identity categories he was born into, is an act of love that I may not have fully appreciated at the time, but that I appreciate enormously now. The final phase of this story, the phase I am still in, is the phase I think of as integration. Integration is the process of taking everything you have learned about yourself and folding it into a life that works, a life that is honest and functional and connected to other people. It is not the phase where everything is resolved, because I do not think identity is ever fully resolved, and I do not think it should be. I think identity is a living thing that changes as you change, and the goal is not to arrive at a fixed point, but to develop a relationship with yourself that is honest enough to accommodate change and stable enough to survive it. For me, integration has meant a number of things. It has meant being honest with myself about what the crossdressing means to me now, which is different from what it meant to me at 13. At 13, it was a revelation, a crack in the wall that let light into a room I did not know was dark. Now, in my adult life, it is a small, private practice that I engage in occasionally, a way of reconnecting with a part of myself that I do not always have room to express in the ordinary course of my life. It is not the center of my identity, but it is part of it, and I have stopped trying to cut it out or push it away, because I have learned that the parts of yourself you try to destroy do not go away, they just go underground and come back in forms that are harder to manage. Integration has also meant developing a more nuanced understanding of gender and identity in general, one that goes beyond my own experience. I've spent time reading and learning about the experiences of transgender people, of non-binary people, of other people who crossdress, and I have come to understand that my experience is one point on a very wide spectrum, and that the spectrum itself is a natural and enduring feature of human diversity, not an aberration or a trend. This understanding has made me more empathetic, more careful in the language I use, more willing to listen to people whose experiences are different from my own, and more committed to creating space for those experiences in the conversations and communities I am part of. Integration has meant repairing and deepening my relationships. My relationship with Megan, which was tested by what happened when we were teenagers, has become one of the most important relationships in my life. She is the person who first saw this part of me and chose compassion over judgment, and that choice, made when she was 16 years old, is one of the most significant acts of kindness anyone has ever shown me. We talk openly now, in a way that we did not before, and the openness has made our relationship richer and more honest than it would have been if I had never been caught on that sofa in her uniform. My relationship with my parents has also evolved. My mother asks questions now, thoughtful ones, and sometimes she gets things wrong and I correct her gently and she accepts the correction, and that exchange, repeated many times, has built a kind of trust between us that did not exist when I was hiding. My father still does not bring it up often, but he has stopped avoiding the topic when it arises naturally, and he recently asked me, in his own halting way, whether I was happy, and I said I was, and he nodded, and the nod carried more weight than a speech would have. Integration has meant accepting responsibility for the things I did wrong along the way. I used my sister's clothes without her permission, and regardless of what those clothes meant to me, that was a violation, and I have had to sit with that and own it fully, not as a footnote in a larger story about my identity, but as a real thing that I did to another person, a person who trusted me and who had a right to the privacy and integrity of her own belongings. I have also had to accept responsibility for the ways I lied to people, the ways I performed a version of myself that was not honest, the ways I let fear drive me to choices that hurt me and, occasionally, hurt others. Taking responsibility for these things has not been about punishing myself. It has been about recognizing that growth requires honesty about your own behavior, not just honesty about your feelings, and that you cannot ask the world to accept you if you are not willing to honestly face the parts of yourself that have caused harm. I want to say something about mental health, because this story would be incomplete without it. The years of secrecy and shame took a toll on me that I am still, in some ways, paying. I developed anxiety in my mid-teens that persisted into my 20s, a low-level, constant hum of worry that colored everything, and that I now understand was a direct result of living with an unexpressed part of myself in a world that I believed would reject me if that part were known. I went through periods of depression, particularly between the ages of 15 and 17, when the gap between who I was and who I was pretending to be was at its widest, and there were nights when I lay awake and wondered whether the effort of maintaining the pretense was worth it. I never made a plan, but I had moments of such profound exhaustion that the idea of simply stopping, of not having to get up and be the person everyone expected, felt like relief, and I know now that those moments were warning signs, and I am grateful that I had a sister who was paying attention and a counselor who gave me language for what I was experiencing, and I want to say, to anyone listening who recognizes themselves in what I am describing, that the exhaustion is real and it is valid. And it is not a character failure, and that the relief you are looking for is not in stopping, but in starting to be honest, in starting to let people in starting to build a life that has room in it for all of you. I also want to say something about the difference between exploration and compulsion because I think it is important and because it is something I had to learn. When I was in the thick of it, the urge to wear the uniform felt compulsive, like something I could not control, and that feeling frightened me because it made me feel like I was at the mercy of something I did not understand. What I learned through therapy and reflection and time was that the compulsion was partly a function of the secrecy. When something is forbidden and hidden, it takes on a power that is disproportionate to its actual importance because the energy you spend suppressing it feeds it, and the fear of discovery amplifies the desire, and the whole thing becomes a feedback loop that feels uncontrollable. When I started being honest about it, when I started talking about it and understanding it and integrating it into my life in a way that was conscious and chosen rather than compulsive and hidden, the urgency diminished. The desire did not disappear, but it changed from something that felt like it was driving me to something that felt like it was part of me, and that shift from being driven to being accompanied is, I think, the essence of what it means to integrate a difficult part of yourself. I am not going to tell you that everything is perfect now because that would be a lie, and this story has been about many things, but one of the most important is the cost of lying, and I will not end it with one. Things are not perfect. There are still moments when I feel the old shame rise up, usually in unexpected contexts, a comment someone makes, a joke on television, a glance from a stranger, and the shame is smaller than it used to be, but it is not gone, and I do not know if it will ever be entirely gone, because the world we live in still has very strong opinions about these things, and living in that world means absorbing some of those opinions no matter how hard you work to reject them. There are still moments when I wonder whether I have understood myself correctly, whether the framework I have built for making sense of this experience is the right one, whether there is something underneath it all that I have not yet seen. I think this kind of uncertainty is healthy. I think the moment you become completely certain about who you are is the moment you stop growing, and I do not want to stop growing. What I can tell you is that I am more at peace now than I have ever been. I am more honest with myself and with the people in my life. I am more empathetic because having had to wrestle with something this difficult has given me an appreciation for the fact that everyone is wrestling with something and that the things people carry inside them are often invisible and that kindness costs nothing and is worth everything. I am more resilient, not because I've become tougher, but because I have become more flexible, more willing to sit with discomfort, more able to hold contradictory feelings without needing to resolve them immediately. And I am more grateful for a sister who chose compassion, for a counselor who chose patience, for parents who chose to try, for friends who chose to stay, and for the simple, extraordinary fact of having survived the years when I was not sure I would. If there is a lesson in this story, it is not a simple one, because identity is not a simple thing. But if I had to distill it, I would say this. The parts of yourself that frighten you are not your enemies. They are aspects of you that have not yet been understood, and understanding them requires honesty and patience and courage and, usually, the help of other people. The world will try to tell you who you are, and some of what it tells you will be true, and some of it will be false. And the work of your life is to learn the difference, and that work is never finished, and that is not a defect. That is the nature of being alive. And the people around you, the ones who matter, are more capable of love than you might believe when you are sitting alone in the dark with a secret that feels too big to carry. You do not have to tell everyone. You do not have to tell anyone before you are ready. But when you are ready, when you have done the work of understanding yourself enough to speak clearly about what you have found, you may discover that the world is wider than you thought, and that there is more room in it for you than you were led to believe. I also want to say plainly that what I did was a mistake. Wearing my sister's uniform without her permission was a violation of her trust and her privacy, and I do not romanticize it, and I do not use the word mistake in the title of this story to be provocative. I use it because it is accurate. I was young and confused, and I did something that crossed a boundary, and the fact that the boundary crossing led, eventually, to growth and understanding does not retroactively make it okay. The ends do not justify the means, and personal growth does not exempt you from accountability. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in the early part of my story, I want you to hear this clearly. Explore, question, discover, but do it in ways that respect the people around you. Do not use other people's belongings or identities or trust as instruments of your own self-discovery without their knowledge and consent. There are other ways, better ways, and you deserve to find them, and the people in your life deserve to be treated with the same care that you are asking the world to treat you with. I think that is the thing I most want to leave you with. Not the drama of the discovery, not the tension of the confrontation, not the relief of the acceptance, but the simple, quiet principle that underlies all of it, which is that self-knowledge and other respect are not in conflict, and that a life lived with both is a life that is worth living, and that the path to that life is not straight or easy or clearly marked, but it is walkable, and you do not have to walk it alone. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.